DC Alan Breakwell seems to have had a number of problems with paperwork. When Operation Gunter searched his home, they found police notebooks which had been faked or stolen, confidential intelligence files relating to informants, and a receipt for an informant's reward. It was blank, save for the informant's signature, Mr. C, the man accused of setting up Taylor and Southall. The case against DC Alan Breakwell doesn't end there. Operation Gunter was looking into the most serious allegation of all.
It was alleged by informants, two informants, that they were requested to sell heroin on behalf of one of the police officers.
Sell heroin?
Sell heroin, yes.
Who was the police officer?
DC Break.
One of those making this extraordinary claim was Breakwell's former informant, the man we met by the canal.
Breakwell gave me an ounce and a half of heroin to sell on the streets.
He gave you heroin to sell?
He gave me an ounce and a half of heroin, and he wanted £1,200.
What was your view of that?
The first thing I did is that I phoned another police officer in a different part of the country who I trusted, told him what was going on. He told me to be very careful because he thought I was being set up, and they don't have that stuff in my house. And I put Breakwell off by saying I couldn't sell it, so nobody wants it. And so what he done then, he asked for it back, so I gave him it back.
The second informant who rounded on Breakwell was Steve Russell. He's now serving a 9-year jail sentence for unrelated drugs offences. In 1995, Russell turned up at his lawyer's. He was desperate.
He presented himself at my office as a very worried man. What he wanted, and what he said to me quite candidly, was, what can we do to get these people off my back? It had gone far beyond anything I'd ever met before with the drug squad. The original approach to my client was that he should provide information, but it rapidly became clear that he was being asked to provide more than information. He was being asked to provide drugs which were to be sold to other users and dealers.
Who was asking him to do that?
The officer he knew as Basher, who I believe to be DC Breakwell.
And where were the drugs coming from?
DC Breakwell.
So the policeman himself was providing the drugs to your client?
According to my client, the drugs were given to him by Breakwell to be supplied to others.
Panorama has spoken to Steve Russell in prison. He's given us a detailed account of his dealings with DC Basher Breakwell. He says he sold at least 25 ounces of heroin for Breakwell. If true, the detective was responsible for putting a minimum of £20,000 worth of the drug onto the streets. To support his allegations, Russell offered Operation Gunter a diary he'd kept. It reveals some of his transactions with Breakwell, packages of heroin Russell received and the money from selling them, which he passed back to the detective. January the 22nd, £800 to Basher for H. March the 17th, 3 from Basher. 700 to Basher, 1100 to Basher. Operation Gunter's file on Detective Constable Alan Breakwell was complete. He'd allegedly tried to steal money, a large quantity of drugs in his possession had gone missing, and there were claims that he'd framed suspects and organised the sale of large amounts of hard drugs. After 2 years' investigations, Operation Gunter sent its evidence on Detectives Houston, Sullivan, Rowbottom and Breakwell to the Director of Public Prosecutions. Previous inquiries had found it at this point, but Operation Gunter was different, or so it was thought. Yet once again, the DPP's response was no criminal charges. For some, it was a huge disappointment.
Here you've got, apparently, honest police officers willing to go into the witness box and testify against colleagues. Now, that hasn't happened very often in the past in the West Midlands, and therefore I am especially surprised that they've decided not to go ahead in this case, although, of course, I haven't seen all the evidence.
With no criminal prosecutions, it was left to the West Midlands Police to bring disciplinary charges. Detective Inspector Sullivan, Sergeant Rowbottom and Constable Houston were all sacked from the force. Dick Houston for misappropriating £100 cash, Pat Sullivan for misappropriating one of 16 packages found during a drug search, Kim Rowbottom for misappropriating a substance believed to be skunk cannabis. Sullivan and Rowbottom have lodged appeals. At an awards ceremony last month, those detectives who gave evidence against the corrupt men were formally commended by the Chief Constable.
But we're also going to hear tonight about another sort of bravery, and that's a moral bravery, a moral courage, where individual officers have stood up to, in difficult circumstances, where there's been serious police misbehaviour.
Among those commended was DC Paul Blackford, who testified against Sullivan and Houston. DC Steve Pike, who gave evidence against Rowbottom. And Detective Dave Wallbank. His evidence against Sullivan was uncorroborated, and that charge didn't succeed. But Dave Wallbank was still warmly praised for speaking out. But what of Gunter's prime target, Detective Constable Breakwell? Having escaped criminal prosecution, he too was supposed to face a string of disciplinary charges, but he didn't. Basher Breakwell claimed to be under so much stress and strain from the investigation that doctors judged him unfit to face the tribunal. He's now retired, as permitted under current regulations, with a lump sum payoff of more than £60,000 and an index-linked medical pension.
It's been going on for many years. Police officers facing serious disciplinary or criminal offences have been allowed to fade away on enhanced pensions on the grounds of sickness.
Chris Mullin is now chairman of the Commons Committee which oversees the police.
I don't think stress, which is always very hard to quantify anyway, that arises from the fact that an officer is being investigated for possible serious criminal or disciplinary offences, should be an excuse for not having to appear in court or at a tribunal.
We went to see the now former Detective Constable Alan Breakwell at his home in Worcestershire. We wanted to give him the opportunity to answer the allegations of stealing, framing and dealing. Hello, here's Alan Breakwell.
No, he isn't at the moment.
Can I, Mr. Breakwell, can I have a word?
No, he's not here.
He just said shut the door. Is that...
No, he isn't.
I mean, we've just seen him in. Is it possible to have a brief word with him about the...
No,
Mr.
why?
Breakwell? Alan Basher Breakwell was no more prepared to talk to us than to the West Midlands Police Tribunal. Looking at the case of former DC Alan Breakwell, now here's an officer who was potentially facing very serious charges, yet he now gets an index-linked enhanced pension. What do you think about that?
I'm offended by it, and I've no doubt those that know the circumstances around him, police officers serving around him, feel insulted by it, and I think it's an affront to the public. I mean, he does receive an enhanced pension, and it's absolutely right, those arrangements should be in place to look after officers who've been ill or injured, performing their duty for the public. But it can't possibly be right that an officer who becomes ill, genuinely or otherwise, after discovery of serious misbehaviour, can be perceived as being rewarded for what he or she did. And it isn't fair to the officer either. Mr. Breakwell has never had these allegations tested against him.
He doesn't want to either, does he?
Well, it appears not. Sad, isn't it? And it's certainly sad for me.
Following Operation Gunter, the West Midlands Police now has a full-time anti-corruption squad. They're already investigating new cases.